Hello. Now this is part three of my video on, what is my video on? Oh, I don't have that text anymore. So anyway, this is part three, the video on the exclusive uh, capacity of the individual to decide for herself. And in the previous videos, I went over my argument, my basic argument, which was based on the privacy and supremacy of subjectivity, and why only the individual can decide for himself, because everyone has, because subjectivity is a totally private thing, and because objectivity comes out of that. So there really is no independent objective knowledge upon which decisions can be made for somebody else. So in this video, I want to add into my table of contents the schizophrenia of believing in government. I went over the definition of society, which is voluntary, the definition of government, which is involuntary, and now let's go over this. This isn't it here. Oh, okay. So the fact is that if government is force, and I played that video of Jan Helfield interviewing the senator from Hawaii in part two, and it's just absurd to, even for people like Ron Paul, who profess to be very radical libertarians, are not radical. He's not a radical libertarian. When he's asked if he's a anarcho-capitalist, if he believes in no government, he says no. He says, I can't see how police can just be competitive or private and in a free market. And of course, why not? I mean, you believe in everything else should be a free market. Why not police and courts and roads and education? Of course, he believes in private education or whatever the particular state wants to do, because he's a constitutionalist, a decentralist, according to the Constitution. But he's not consistent, and it doesn't make any sense to be violent. Now, I was saying that subjectivity, uh, subjectivity, or I mean, the nature of the individual is simply inconsistent. It's consistent with society, which is voluntary, but it's not consistent with government, because if there is no difference between government and slavery, and in slavery, if you have a slave, you're by definition not helping your slave. And to not beg the question, government is slavery because you have no choice. You have to contribute to the government, and there's no reason for it based on our natures. Our natures are the opposite of government, of being forced to tell what to do. Autonomy is the only natural condition in life. Being a slave is not. Because even if you're incompetent, you need to be free in order to find out the consequences of your own decisions. So now, that's part that part I wanted to add, how crazy it is to believe in government, and we've been brainwashed by government schools to believe that, and by government media or government controlled media. Many, many, many libertarians believe in government, and that's why I talked about all these from the least, how many libertarians have an aversion to making all these things voluntary. But when you get down to professional licensing, it becomes fewer libertarians are against that, and probably roads, fewer are against the privatization of roads and the removal of government influence in the construction of roads. And education, very few libertarians are in favor of public education. Milton Friedman was sort of that way. Monetary policy, there are quite a few libertarians in favor of government monetary policy or labor policy. So anyway, let me go back to this part here. Direct, a priori, and consequent definitional consequences for a free society. So let's go down to this chart here. Let's see, this is a different video here that I've got the text for, but I'll go right down to, oh, it looks like I got a little messed up here. Okay, here we are. All right, so freedom, no government, anarchy, okay? So you see that all these different areas of life, creativity, communications, uh, the areas of expenditure, the areas of gains and income, the areas of authority, the areas of rule of law, consistent application of law, the areas of war or peace, the areas of contract. There's a little mess up here. The areas of competition and the areas of knowledge. All these areas of society work much better simply because only the individual is competent to make decisions for himself when he is free to do so. And so what you get is you get certain economic results of that. Uh, the fact that people can donate resources for any project in order to be able to communicate, for instance. It takes resources to communicate. It isn't just a matter of being free to say what you want. It's a matter of a matter of being able to take solicitations from anywhere you want to communicate with, to present your point of view. Now, when you're talking about government, then you're talking about something that's illegitimate in the first place. So the application of free speech to political speech doesn't take you anywhere anyhow. I mean, if Ron Paul had got elected, he probably would have ended up being corrupt because the country is just not pure enough. I mean, even Thomas Jefferson did things which were against his own principles when he was president. It's just there's too many pressures in government because government is a monopoly on the initiation of violence, and there are huge incentives for people to get their special rewards from the government by stealing from the people as a whole. And the same with creativity. You see, people talk. You see leftists talking all the time about how the government created the internet. If it wasn't for the government, we wouldn't have the internet. And I was watching one of these guys yesterday, and I thought, that's bullshit. If private enterprise would have created the internet without government, without these military initiations that started up the internet, the government, I mean, I'm sure there were things going on, but we don't have full capitalization. We've never had freedom to accumulate wealth in this country because government expenditures, government is always by definition, it's expenditures. It cannot generate wealth. And so that over the past 100 years, for instance, when the progressives started taking over the markets with the Federal Reserve and so on, and interference with business, the way Hoover did and Roosevelt did. Hoover wasn't laissez-faire. He was just the opposite. He was the same thing as Roosevelt, except not as much as Roosevelt. But in fact, Roosevelt ran against him as a laissez-faire person. So, but it takes resources to be a sense of profit. You have to have a sense of profit, and that's why we would live in a Star Trek world if we hadn't had so much government in the last 100 years. I have no doubt about it. Of course, you can't say what would come out, but I'm sure we'd be 10 to 100 times richer. Even the poorest person would be extremely comfortable. And the same with free society. Private property rights is a precondition of freedom, of being an individual. Nobody has any right to tax you for some project over which you have no control other than through a ballot box, which is absurd. I mean, that means the majority wins and the minority loses, right? And the majority loses as well, even though they think they're winning. And I mentioned information. You see, information doesn't require force. It doesn't require. I was watching Sam Seder debate Peter Schiff, and Sam Seder was insistent that research shows that that if companies paid for health care, or for birth control, that the companies would save money. Well, how does he know that? I mean, that's not an experimental subject. It's up to the individual company to decide if that was the case. You know, I mean, they're incentivized to do so. The intellectuals are not incentivized to do that. Well, they are to some extent, but you can't really tell, except in the real world, what's going to work. And it's not as a principle, but it's what Ludwig von Mises called thymology. You just kind of judge the situation. You don't really, there's no real science of how to do business. That's bullshit. And it's the same with competition. The reason that there's competition is because there's freedom. To say that you want less competition or you want protectionism or you don't want something to go away because somebody will become unemployed is to say you don't want freedom and competition. British Petroleum, for instance, doesn't wants cap and trade because they don't want competition from startup oil companies. It's the same in the securities business. They want huge amounts of regulation in the security business. It's much more than it was 20 years ago, contrary to what the left keeps insisting on. And it's impossible to start up in the securities business nowadays unless you have huge capital because you can't handle the regulatory burden. Or in the 19th century railroads, they could not cartelize. It was impossible when they cartelized for them to maintain their cartels. They couldn't do it because somebody in the cartel always cheated. He always gave some rebates rather than explicitly lower his prices. He would tell people, I'll give you a rebate. And when people found that out in the cartel, the cartel would always break up. And that's the nature of life, that as long as it's not a central monopoly on force, a society of force, there's always competition. That's why the price of kerosene declined in the 19th century so much. In the last half of the 19th century, after it saved the whales, because they didn't have to kill whales anymore to have lamp oil. That's why the competition declined. I mean, that's why the price of kerosene declined and the quality increased throughout the second half of the 19th century, because even though Rockefeller had 90% of the market, a good deal of that time, he had a lot of competitors who were chomping at the bit to take over his markets. So it's ridiculous to say that the robber barons, through the competitive market, were controlling the market, because everything was getting cheaper in those days. It was the best times for the working man in the history of the world in the 1880s, I'd say. 1870s were not as good, but they were pretty good. The 1890s were pretty good. There were recessions in those days because we had a fractional reserve pyramided banking system in those days. It started in 1863. I forget the name of the act, but that was the precursor to the Federal Reserve before we actually had a central bank. But we had centralization or pyramidization of the banking system. It was designed by Congress that way. And of course, we don't have voluntary cooperation. You can't associate with anyone you want. This extreme example, or the most politically challenging example, is the one of the Civil Rights Act of